Quite a few churches and ministers have been in touch with me in recent days asking about life post-lockdown as various bits of legislation and expectation begin to emerge. And if you haven't seen the video put out by Bethany Baptist Church in South Wales, I really would recommend it. But let me just say, they're having a laugh. They are making the point in a very funny and a very skillful way that we just can't carry on by working around the restrictions. We've got to think a little bit differently. But as I've seriously wrestled with that question with a number of churches, two things have really become very clear to me. The first is that there is no single answer to that question. Our churches are in so many different circumstances, our buildings, our demographics, our locations are all so different. There just isn't a one-size-fits-all response. And I can recognise that we might really be looking for a very clear shared roadmap at the moment, because we're all in unfamiliar territory. None of us have ever been through a situation like this before, so we would obviously find it hugely reassuring if we knew we were on the right page, so to speak, because everyone else was on that page too. But as I said, I just don't think there's going to be a one-size-fits-all answer. Which leads me to my second observation, which is we're going to need to be proactive and not reactive in our response. We're going to need to think things through and decide for ourselves what is right. Now, this is not the context to give you an update on official government advice and guidelines. Please look at our Baptist Together website and the regular updates for that. But as that information emerges, I think it is really important that we don't confuse permission with instruction. Much of what is coming out of the various briefings is what we can do, not what we have to do. If you live in the UK and you reach 17 years of age, you are allowed to get a provisional licence and learn to drive. That doesn't mean that every 17-year-old has to immediately start taking driving lessons. And in a similar way, I think that the future is not just a matter of doing what the various changes allow, or even what various news bulletins tell people that we're going to do, but deciding what's right for us. Of course, we've got to remain within those safety guidelines, but within those guidelines, deciding what is right for our church and our situation. And as I've reflected on that, the phrase that's come to my mind is seek first the kingdom of God. Now, perhaps if we're looking for a common narrative at the moment, that might be it. Recognising that to seek the kingdom of God in our own particular context might be very different in practical terms to what that means for someone else. And I recently led a session at our Latchford Learning Community, online of course, to help people to think this through. And one or two suggested that it might be helpful if I shared that presentation more widely. So I've put this short video together to just let you see it. If you haven't done already, I'd also encourage you to take a look at our Leaders Update 6.1, which offers 4 key questions that I think might be quite useful to be asking at the moment. And also maybe take a look at the Leaders section in the COVID-19 area of our website, where particularly again in section 6 there is a download which goes into some detail, and it offers you a framework to help you consider things as you go forward, encouraging you to look at the practical aspects but also the pastoral, the missional and the theological aspects of any decisions that you make. So please let me emphasize again, this is not the place to find official advice and updates, but rather to help you think through your response to those updates. So this is a presentation originally prepared for our Latchford Learning Community that I hope you might find helpful. I think we're beginning to recognise that life after lockdown may mean that actually different churches have to respond and have to react in different ways, at least initially. And so this phrase, seek first the kingdom of God, might be a helpful way of both recognising something of that diversity, but also giving us a sense of common purpose. But what does that actually mean for us in practice, to seek first the kingdom of God? What I simply want to do is look at some words of Jesus and think about how in different ways each of those says something to us about this. And maybe we should begin in Matthew chapter 6, where we first read that phrase, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And what was interesting is that when I first shared these words with a group of ministers, many of them actually focused in on the phrase that follows follows. Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. And one of the things that was coming out in the conversation was simply, we cannot predict what the future is going to be like. We maybe won't be able to predict even what restrictions are in place and how they're going to change and how they're going to vary. But we also can't really predict what people are going to be like. We don't even know who might have stopped coming to our churches, who might start coming, and we don't know what people are going to bring with them. We may have people who really have been quite traumatized by recent events and just need the space to process that. There may be others who've been bereaved and they've never had the chance to sort of go through the usual processes that we would enable them to do within the life of a church. And so people will be bringing all kinds of different things. There may be those who during lockdown have got some very fixed ideas about what church is about and where it should be going, and that'll be true of us as well as leaders. And therefore, perhaps to turn up at a church which has got a very fixed sense of where it's going and what its strategy is might not be helpful, particularly in the early days. You know, Jurgen Klopp, forgive me for forever mentioning football and Liverpool FC, but I remember he was being interviewed on one occasion after Liverpool had got a pretty good victory, but against a team that wasn't a particularly high level team. I think it was a cup game or something. And Kloppy was being interviewed, and they sort of pointed out to him that although Liverpool had got a pretty emphatic victory, it wasn't that great a team that they were playing. And Kloppy said, look, you can only play the team that are in front of you on the pitch. And that phrase has kind of stuck with me recently, because I wonder whether that's part of the instinct that we need to develop as a church going forward. We need to learn how to deal with what's in front of us rather than try and necessarily plan what all our activities and our strategies are going to be. We need to be a people who can simply work out, what does the kingdom of God look like for this person? What does it look like in that situation? So maybe one of the things that post-lockdown church needs to learn to be is to just be a church of the moment, be a church that inhabits the reality that confronts us, and maybe just be a little bit more flexible and are not too concerned if things maybe aren't quite exactly what we might plan. And so I want to look at this idea of seeking the kingdom of God through three parables of Jesus that we find in the Gospels, and particularly perhaps by looking for some of the contrasts between these three. They're all about people who in different ways find something. And the first of those is in Luke chapter 15, the story of the woman who finds a coin that she had lost. And the thing that struck me about this particular story is it was something she already had, something she realized was valuable, and something she didn't want to be without. And I guess that one of the things that we've realized in recent days is that we've lost an awful lot of our routines and our services and access to our buildings and such like. But I guess that there's a need to look at that and to think about, okay, what really matters? What of all the things that we've lost and therefore that we want to re-find, which are the ones of real value? And maybe we're going to need a little bit of discernment in just looking at things and not just assuming to just do the things that we can or the things that legislation allows, but saying, you know, what's really valuable, what really matters in our life as a church together. And I think we can look at this in two ways. There's what I might describe as the short-term view and then the long-term view. What I mean by that is okay, there is stuff that we've lost immediately because of lockdown. And I know that a lot of people perhaps are going to be coming back into church with a very clear sense of, we want to restart this, or we want to be able to carry on doing that again, because a few months ago we suddenly lost the ability to do that. And so, yeah, you know, there's that sense of reclaiming this thing that we've lost. But I wonder whether we also, alongside that, need to take what I might call a long-term view, because I think we've also learned some things during lockdown. And perhaps what we've learned is that there are things that in the years and perhaps even decades leading up to this coronavirus crisis, there are things that we've lost sight of as churches. There are things that perhaps we've lost our emphasis on. And so it's going to be a question again of maybe what do we need to reclaim from years gone by, or from values of previous generations. And there's almost a hint of that, I think, within the narrative here, because we notice that it finishes by saying, I tell you, there's rejoicing in the presence of the angels over one sinner who repents. So in the middle of this, Jesus is kind of reminding us what the church is all about. At the end of the day, the church is about enabling people to turn their lives around, to live differently, to go in an opposite direction. So yeah, we're going to have to balance the sort of short-term desire to restart everything with perhaps that long-term question of saying, what do we need to rediscover from longer in our heritage, and reclaim that in the life of post-COVID church? And then a second of those dimensions is perhaps introduced to us by another parable of Jesus, of someone finding something. And this is the first of two that appear together in Matthew chapter 13. And it's the story of the man who finds treasure hidden in a field. And it appears just before the story of the pearl merchant, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And as I look at these two characters in particular, it strikes me that the great contrast between them is that the guy who finds the treasure in the field, in essence, finds something that he wasn't really looking for. He just stumbles across it. But he then recognizes that what he stumbled across is worth investing in. It's worth essentially buying the field for. And I think one of the things that we've noticed during this period of lockdown is that some of the changes that have taken place in society, some of the behaviours that we've observed in our communities, in another way, we might well phrase as signs of God's kingdom, as behaviours that belong to the kingdom of God. And so perhaps one of the things that we need to be willing to do as a church is to recognise some of the things we've seen going on in our communities, and to say, well, God's been at work in that. Or maybe ask ourselves that question: what would the kingdom of God look like? Not so much in this church, but in this community. And how do we have to adapt as a church to be able to serve the opportunities and the realities of the community that's around us? And so that, I think, is going to become perhaps the second dimension of church after lockdown. A church that's actually willing to invest, and it would have cost him money to buy that field, in recognizing that we have discovered new things. We've perhaps seen God at work in people that we didn't see God at work in before, and that also might include our church community. There may be people in our church community that have come to the fore during this period of lockdown who maybe were a little bit overlooked in the past, or perhaps even, dare I say, the other way round. So maybe that's another question. What is it that we've seen? What have we discovered in recent weeks that we now need to take ownership of, so to speak, as we move forward after lockdown? And as I've said, the pearl merchant is almost the opposite of the treasure finder, because the pearl merchant knows exactly what he's looking for. He's given his life to basically trying to collect and to find pearls. And then suddenly he comes across this one pearl, this one example that is so what he's about, that is just so absolutely the very thing that he realizes his whole life and purpose is about, that he's actually willing to just get rid of all the others, to let them go, in order to be able to invest in the one thing that really matters to him. Now, again, I think there's quite an issue here for us as leaders and as leadership teams, because many of us, one of the things that this lockdown period has done is it's given us time to reflect. It's given us time to think. And again, I've touched on this already, the idea of discovering new things. But if we are going to come back from this period with a deeper sense of purpose, or perhaps with a very clear sense that this is what really matters, we've got to recognize the fact that the pearl merchant was willing to let other things go. He was willing to release those things for the sake of the one thing that he knew was what he was about, the one thing that he knew represented his purpose in life. And so there may be a sense in which, as we come back together, what is that we've always been looking for? What has God shown us in these days of lockdown that really needs to become our key focus, and that therefore will require of us sacrifice and investment if we're truly going to make that a reality? So, as I've said, this isn't some great, long, in-depth study of everything. It's just perhaps a little framework to help us to put some flesh, as it were, onto that statement of seek the kingdom of God as we go forward. And therefore, I'd suggest from these stories there are maybe 4 dimensions of that might help us to think about what kind of church we want to be. To what degree do we need to be a church that is just flexible and able to respond to whatever we discover? And perhaps if we're going to do that, then we need to learn to seek the kingdom of God in our here and now. We need to kind of get that instinct of discovering where God is present, even in our existing restrictions and struggles. To what degree do we need to be a church that reclaims its heritage, that perhaps realizes that either some of the things that we've had to recently stop doing really do matter and really are valuable, but also perhaps because of the change and because of the disruption, what have we rediscovered from even earlier generations that perhaps we do need to put a re-emphasis on? I think we need to be a church that's ready to discover new things and to perhaps recognize that some of those things may not be contained within our existing structures, or perhaps some of the people, as I said earlier, within our communities have perhaps got more to offer than we realized. And I suspect we also need to be a church that's prepared to invest in what really matters and to recognize that that won't be without cost. That won't be something that doesn't make its demands on us. But if something is really worthwhile, if something truly is of the kingdom of God, then we need to be ready to put our investment in it, and we need to be ready to let go of other things in order for that to become a reality. So I hope those few thoughts perhaps just help us to begin those discussions that we need to have together.